The hall was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and expensive. Sunlight came through the tall windows, falling on the empty, polished wood of the stage. In the center sat a grand piano, a great black, shiny beast waiting to be tamed. Rows of velvet seats faced it, all empty except for the first one. There, a man sat perfectly still. He was an older man, with sharp, gray eyes and hair the color of silver. His hands, resting on his knees, were long-fingered and looked both strong and delicate. This was the Maestro. To everyone in the world of music, he was a giant. His name was spoken with respect and a little bit of fear. He wrote music that critics called unforgivingly brilliant, and he played with a cold, perfect beauty that could make you feel small. Across the city, in a small apartment that always smelled of old books and coffee, a young woman was having a very different morning. Her name was Alara. She was 22, with hands that were often smudged with pencil lead from writing notes on sheet music. Her apartment was small. Her piano was old and slightly out of tune, but when she played, the whole room seemed to lean in and listen. Alara did not come from a famous school or a musical family. She came from a small town where her first piano was a battered keyboard from a second-hand store. She learned by feeling, by letting the music wash over her and through her. It was like a storm inside her chest, and when she played, she let the storm out. Her teachers at the local conservatory would shake their heads. "So much passion, Alara," they would say. But passion is not control. You must build a bridge between your heart and your fingers. Now the rhythm here, it is not precise. Alara knew this. She knew she sometimes rushed through the sad parts or hammered too hard on the angry ones. But to her, the music was alive, a creature that needed to run free. She had sent a recording of herself playing to a competition on a whim, a wild, emotional performance of a piece by Rachmaninoff. To her shock, she won a prize, a spot in a masterclass with the great Maestro himself. It was a chance of a lifetime. It was also terrifying not now, standing backstage in the great concert hall. She could hear the quiet murmur of the other students. There were 6 of them, all from big-name academies in big cities. They spoke in low, serious voices about finger techniques and historical interpretations. They wore neat, dark clothes. Alara looked down at her own simple dress and felt a wave of doubt. She wiped her sweaty palms on her skirt. The Maestro's assistant, a nervous young man with glasses, called the first student. One by one, they went out. Alara listened from the wings. The playing was incredible. It was clean, clear, and perfect. Every note was in its right place, like soldiers in a line. When each one finished, there was a pause, and then the Maestro's voice would come, low and steady. "Adequate," he would say. Or, "The third movement lacked clarity." You think about the notes, but not the space between them. His words were not yelled, but they fell like stones. Then it was her turn. The assistant called her name. Her heart was beating so loudly, she was sure the Maestro could hear it from his seat. She walked out into the vast space. The stage lights were warm, and the silence was immense. She sat on the piano bench, which felt too high. She adjusted it, her movements clumsy. She took a deep, shaky breath and looked at the keys. She had chosen to play a piece by Chopin, a nocturne. It was a piece full of moonlight and longing. She began to play. From the first chord, she was not in the hall anymore. She was somewhere else. The storm inside her rose up, and she poured it into the music. She felt the sorrow of the melody deep in her bones. She let her hands slow down in the aching parts. She let the loud sections ring out with a raw pain. She didn't think about her fingers or what the Maestro might say. She just let the story of the music happen. When the last note faded, she felt empty and quiet. She slowly put her hands in her lap and looked up. The maestro was looking at her. His face showed no anger, no pleasure. He just looked at her for a long time. Then the corners of his mouth moved upwards. It was a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a small, thin smile of polite patience. It was the kind of smile a wise adult gives a child who has just tried very hard to explain something complicated. "Thank you," he said, his voice dry. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what is your name again?" "Elara," she said, her voice a whisper. "Elara," he repeated. He steepled his fingers. "You play with a great deal of feeling." He said the word feeling as if it were a slightly interesting bug he had found under a glass. "It is clear the music moves you. That is not nothing. Many play and are not moved." Elara felt a tiny flicker of hope. Then he continued. "But," he said, and the word landed heavily, "feeling without architecture is merely noise. What you have given us is a flood. A flood washes everything away, the beautiful gardens and the careful pathways alike. Music is not a flood. It is a city. It must be built. Every stone, every street must be placed with intention. Your rhythm changes with your mood. Your dynamics are a landslide, not a staircase. You have the heart of a musician, perhaps, but you do not yet have the hands." He paused, letting his words sink in. Elara felt her face grow hot. The hope was gone, replaced by a cold shame. "You remind me of a young horse," the maestro said, and now his smile seemed a little kinder, but that somehow made it worse. It was a smile of pity, full of wild energy, but running in all directions. "You must learn the fences. You must learn the path. Otherwise, you will never reach where you need to go." He nodded, a clear sign she was dismissed. "We will see if you can learn to build. For our final session, you will all play my composition, Capriccio in Gray. You will find the sheet music at the front. Good day." Elara stood up, her legs weak. She walked off the stage, not looking at anyone. The other students were gathering their things, talking softly. She heard one of them, a boy with perfect posture, say under his breath, "A young horse." "That's actually quite accurate." A few of them chuckled quietly. She collected her copy of the Capriccio in Gray. The pages were covered in dense, complex notes. It looked like a mathematical equation, not a piece of music. It was famous for being brutally difficult, a mind game for the fingers. Her heart sank further. This was the opposite of everything she was. This was cold, hard architecture. She walked out of the grand hall into the ordinary afternoon light. The world outside was loud with traffic and people. She felt completely alone. The maestro's smile was burned into her mind. That polite, dismissive smile. He had seen her storm and called it noise. He had seen her heart and called it unskilled. For the first time, she wondered if her way of feeling music was wrong. Maybe the storm inside her was just a chaos that needed to be locked away. She looked down at the sheet music in her hands, a puzzle in black and white. She had 1 week to build a city when all she knew how to do was summon the rain. The week that followed was the longest of Elara's life. The maestro's words played on a loop in her head. Noise, a young horse. They weren't just criticisms. They felt like a judgment on her very soul. The sheet music for the Capriccio in Gray lay on her piano like a legal document, full of dense, angry-looking notes and strange clashing chords. It was nothing like the flowing, emotional pieces she loved. The first day, she just stared at it. She tried to play the first page, slowly, 1 note at a time. It sounded horrible. It was all sharp edges and stumbling rhythms, like trying to walk on broken glass. There was no melody to hold on to, no clear feeling, just intellectual chaos. She felt a crushing sense of defeat. This was the architecture he spoke of? It felt like a prison. The other students from the master class she knew would be approaching this differently. She imagined them in pristine practice rooms, breaking the piece down into sections, drilling the difficult fingerings over and over until they were mechanical and perfect. They would conquer it like a math problem. That was the smart way, the correct way. But every time Ilara tried to do that, her spirit rebelled. The music died under her fingers, becoming a dry academic exercise. On the second day, frustrated and close to tears, she did something else. Instead of practicing, she went to the library. She wasn't looking for music theory books. She was looking for him. She found old biographies, newspaper clippings, interviews with the Maestro from decades past. She learned that he hadn't always been this stern monument of a man. In his youth, he was known for his fiery, passionate performances. The change, the articles subtly suggested, came in his 40s. A great personal loss. His wife, a singer, had passed away suddenly. After that, his music changed. It became more complex, more guarded. The critics called it his gray period. Gray. The word from the title now seemed heavier. This wasn't just a color. It was a state of being. She read an old interview where he was asked about the capriccio in gray. He had said, "It is not about sadness. It is about the silence that comes after the storm has passed, when everything that could be broken is broken." A new idea, fragile as a whisper, began to form in Ilara's mind. What if this piece wasn't a puzzle to be solved, but a map to be followed? What if the chaotic, angry opening wasn't just random? Difficulty. What if it was the storm of grief? She rushed back to her apartment and sat at the piano, the sheet music now looking completely different. She didn't see notes first. She saw a story. She played the first violent, crashing chords. This time, she didn't think about her fingers being in the right place. She thought of a man shocked by a terrible pain, lashing out. The music was ugly because the feeling was ugly. It wasn't meant to be pretty. The middle section was full of stumbling, disjointed rhythms, melodies that started and then fell apart. Instead of fighting to make it smooth, she leaned into the confusion. This was the lost wandering after the shock, the mind unable to focus, the world making no sense. She played it with a hollow uncertainty, letting the pauses feel empty and awkward. And then the finale. After all the noise and chaos, the music stripped away to a single, simple line of notes. A bare, lonely melody. Every other student she'd heard talk about it thought this was the easy part, a moment of calm. But now, Ilara saw it as the hardest part of all. This was the silence after. This was the gray. Playing this with a sweet, pretty sound would be a lie. It had to be played with a kind of quiet devastation, a numbness so complete it was almost peaceful. Her practice sessions transformed. They were no longer about getting it right. They were about getting it true. She would work on a technical section for hours, but not for perfection, for clarity of emotion. She needed that furious run to sound like a sob, that clumsy rhythm to feel like a staggered step. She practiced the final melody over and over, searching for a tone that was clear, cold, and utterly lonely. A sound without warmth. She barely slept. She forgot to eat properly. Her roommate would find her at the piano at 3 a.m, not playing, just sitting with her head in her hands, thinking. "You're going to wear yourself out," her roommate said, worried. "I'm not practicing," Ilara would say quietly. "I'm listening. The music is telling me what it needs." Meanwhile, she saw the other students once at a shared practice hall. She heard. One of them, the boy with perfect posture, working on the same piece. His version was crisp, clean, and impressively fast. It sounded like a brilliant machine. It had no anger, no confusion, no silence. It was just notes, perfectly executed. He finished with a confident flourish. "Nice," another student said. "You've got the architecture down." "Yes," the boy said, looking satisfied. "It's all about structure. The maestro will appreciate that, unlike some people's emotional floods." He didn't look at Alara, but the message was clear. Alara didn't feel competitive anger. She felt a deep, strange pity. They were building a model of a city from the outside, with tiny bricks. She was walking through the real, deserted streets of that city, feeling the cold of its walls. The night before the final masterclass, Alara wasn't practicing. She was sitting on her floor, looking at a faded photograph from one of the library books. It was the maestro years ago, smiling with his arm around a woman with bright eyes. He looked like a different person, young, his face open and full of light. She looked at that picture for a long time. She finally understood. Capriccio in Gray wasn't just a difficult piece he composed. It was his diary. It was the sound of his storm and the long gray silence that followed. He had built his architecture, not to hide from the feeling, but to contain a feeling so vast it would otherwise destroy everything. She went to the piano one last time. She played the piece from start to finish, not for technique, but for the story. When she finished, her small apartment was filled with a resonant quiet. She didn't feel excited or proud. She felt a solemn responsibility and a thread of fear. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be playing a piece for a critical teacher. She would be holding up a mirror to a man who had spent years looking away. She would be playing his private sorrow back to him, perfectly. She closed the piano lid gently. The storm inside her hadn't gone away, but it had found a new shape. It had learned the fences, not to be tamed, but to give its power a direction. Tomorrow, she would walk into his grand, silent hall and show him that she hadn't just learned to build. She had learned to speak his language. The day of the final masterclass arrived with a clear, cold sky. The air felt sharp, like the world itself was holding its breath. Alara walked to the concert hall, her sheet music tucked under her arm. It was wrinkled, covered in pencil marks, not corrections of notes, but small words she had written to herself. Anger here, lost, empty, silence. She didn't feel nervous in the jittery way she had before. This was a different feeling. It was a heavy calm, like a deep river moving slowly. She knew what she needed to do, and that knowledge left no room for panic. She also knew it was a risk. Playing with this much raw understanding could be seen as arrogance, a violation. She was about to walk into a man's private room of grief and turn on the light. Backstage was tense. The other students were warming up their hands, stretching their fingers, their faces tight with concentration. The boy who had played so perfectly last week gave her a quick, dismissive glance. He looked polished and confident. Alara sat quietly on a warm wooden chair, away from the others, and closed her eyes. She didn't run through the notes in her head. Instead, she remembered the story. The storm, the broken pieces, the gray dot the maestro's assistant called the first student. One by one, they went out to perform. From her spot in the wings, Alara could hear them, and she could hear him. Each performance was a marvel of precision. The notes were clean, the rhythms exact, the dynamics followed religiously. They played the capriccio like a mountain to be climbed, and they reached the summit with technical skill. But as she listened, Alara heard only the surface. The furious opening sections sounded impressive, like a thunderstorm in a movie, lots of sound and fury, but you knew it wasn't real. The messy middle parts were smoothed over, made logical. And the final, simple melody? They played it beautifully, sweetly, like a lullaby. It was pretty. It was completely wrong. After each one, there was a pause. Then the maestro's voice would come, low and even, a competent reading, he would say. Or, you have mastered the notes. That is the first step. His words were not cruel, but they were final. They were the sound of a door being gently closed. He thanked them, and they would walk off the stage, some looking relieved, others a little disappointed. He was not impressed, but he was not angry either. He was neutral. Gray dot as the third student finished. Alara peeked around the curtain. The maestro was sitting in his usual seat in the front row, perfectly still. His face was like a mask carved from stone. There was no anticipation in his eyes, no interest. It was as if he was enduring a necessary but dull ceremony. He had heard his piece played correctly many times. He expected nothing more today. When the assistant called her name, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The other students looked up. She was the wild card, the young horse. There was a faint curiosity in their eyes, the kind you have when watching someone walk a tightrope. Alara walked onto the stage. The lights were hotter than she remembered. She saw the maestro. He turned his head to look at her. And then she saw it. The smile. It was the same thin, polite smile from the first day. It was a smile of professional courtesy, edged with a hint of weary patience. His eyes held a mild, almost bored expectation. He was waiting for the flood. He was waiting for the uncontrolled emotion, the beautifulness, the passionate noise. He was ready to be kind, perhaps, to give his final, gentle critique about structure and control. The smile said, "Go ahead, child. Show me what you have learned. I am listening." For a second, looking at that smile, all her certainty wavered. What was she doing? Who was she to think she understood this great man's pain? The urge to play it safe, to just hit the notes correctly, almost overwhelmed her. It would be easier. He would nod, give his advice, and she could leave. But then she thought of the picture. The young man with light in his eyes. She thought of the silence after a real storm. She thought of the gray, not as a color, but as a feeling. She sat at the piano. The room was utterly silent. She adjusted the bench, took a breath that was deep and steady, and placed her hands on the keys. They felt cool and solid. She did not look at the maestro again. She looked at the piano, and then she looked through it, into the story. She began. The first crashing chord was not just loud. It was a shock. It was the sound of a world breaking. She didn't play it with brute force. She played it with a searing, focused rage that made the air in the hall feel tight. The notes that followed weren't just fast and difficult. They were frantic, desperate, the musical equivalent of a mind trying to outrun a terrible truth. She saw the other students in her peripheral vision. They had been slouching, relaxed. Now they were sitting up straight. This was not what they had played. She moved into the stumbling, disjointed middle section. Where others had smoothed it, she let it be awkward. She let the rhythm falter where it was written to falter, creating a sense of profound disorientation. The melody lines that fractured and fell apart sounded genuinely lost, like someone groping in the dark. She played the silence between the phrases, making it feel heavy and empty, not just a rest on the page. She could hear no sound from the hall. No coughs, no shifting in seats. It was a vacuum. And then she reached the end. The final page. The chaos dissolved. The anger spent itself. What was left was that single spare line of melody. The gray. Here she did everything the opposite of the others. She slowed down even more than the tempo marking said. She played each note not with a singing tone, but with a clear, cold, transparent sound. It was like ice. It was not sad. Sadness has warmth to it. This was beyond sadness. This was the quiet after the tears are all gone. She held the notes just a fraction too long, letting them hang in the air and then fade into nothing. The spaces between the notes were the loudest part. It was the sound of an empty room, of a chair no one sits in, of a silence so complete it has its own weight. She played the last note, a single, low tone that was more like a breath than a sound. She kept her finger on the key until the vibration stopped completely, until there was absolutely nothing left. Then, very slowly, she lowered her hands into her lap dot. The silence in the hall was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living thing. It was thick, charged, fragile. No one moved. No one breathed. Alara finally lifted her head. She looked at the maestro. The polite, condescending smile was gone. It had vanished from his face as if it had never been there. His mouth was slightly open. His stern, composed features seemed to have softened, collapsed from within. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale. His gray eyes, usually so sharp and critical, were wide, unblinking. He was not looking at her as a student, or even as a person. He was staring through her, as if she had just spoken a secret he thought was buried in a language only he knew. He looked utterly, completely exposed. And in his eyes there was no anger, no criticism. There was only a shocked, bewildered recognition. The silence stretched on. It wasn't a few seconds. It felt like a minute, maybe more. In that vast, quiet hall, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. The other students in the front rows were frozen. They had come to see a performance, but they had witnessed something else entirely, something that felt private, almost too real to watch. Alara sat perfectly still on the piano bench. Her heart, which had been steady during the music, was now pounding in her ears. She watched the maestro's face, and the shock she saw there made her feel cold. Had she gone too far? Had her attempt at honesty been a terrible mistake, a violation of a man's deepest privacy? The weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders. She hadn't just played notes. She had told his story back to him, and now he was sitting in front of everyone, looking as if he had seen a ghost. The maestro did not move. He didn't blink. He remained in his chair, his body rigid, his gaze locked on the space between them, as if he could still see the last note hanging in the air. The confident, untouchable master was gone. In his place was a man who looked older, thinner, and utterly disarmed. One of the other students shifted in their seat, the sound of fabric scraping against velvet. It was a tiny noise, but in that silence, it was like a thunderclap. It seemed to break the spell. The maestro drew in a breath, a sharp, sudden intake of air, as if he had forgotten to breathe. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, slowly clenched into fists, then opened again. He lowered his eyes from the empty space and looked down at his own hands, studying them as if he didn't recognize them. Alara began to feel a slow creep of fear. She should say something, get up, leave. She started to push herself up from the bench, her muscles stiff. No. The word was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. It was the maestro's voice, but it didn't sound like him. It was stripped of all its gravel and authority. It was just a voice, raw and thin. Alara froze, half standing. She slowly sank back down. He looked up from his hands, and his eyes found hers. There was no anger in them, no disappointment. There was a deep, profound confusion, and something else, a vulnerability that was startling to see on such a stern face. He looked like a man who had been walking in the dark for 20 years, and someone had suddenly turned on a light. He did not speak to the class. He did not offer a critique. He spoke only to her, as if they were the only two people in the universe. The final phrase, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet every syllable carried in the dead quiet of the hall. The last 4 notes, you. You held the third one. You made it? Hollow. Alara nodded, just a small movement of her head. Her throat was too tight to speak. Why? He asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine, desperate question. He needed to know. The marking is a simple diminuendo. A fade. Everyone else fades it. She found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. It's not a fade, she said. It's an emptying. There's nothing left to fade from. He flinched, just a tiny movement around his eyes, as if her words were a physical touch. He looked away again, his jaw working. The other students were watching this exchange with wide, disbelieving eyes. This was not a master class anymore. This was something they did not have a name for. And the middle section, he continued, still looking at the floor. The arpeggios in the left hand. They are clumsy on purpose. They are meant to stumble. But you made them sound lost. Not wrong. Lost. Yes, Ilara said softly. How? The question burst from him, filled with a frustration that wasn't directed at her, but at the mystery she had solved. How did you see that? It is not written there. It is only notes on a page. This was the most dangerous moment. She could lie. She could say she just felt it. But she owed him the truth. She took a breath. I read about the silence, she said, her voice growing a little stronger. After the storm. I read about your silence. I didn't try to play the notes perfectly. I tried to walk the path. The anger first, then the confusion, then the quiet. The gray isn't a color. It's what's left when all the other colors are gone. She saw his shoulders tense. He brought a hand up to his forehead, pressing his fingers against his brow as if he had a sudden headache. For a long moment, he said nothing. The pressure in the room was immense. Everyone was waiting for the explosion, for the maestro to stand and denounce her for presumption, for digging into a life that wasn't hers. Instead, he did something no one expected. He laughed. It was a short, dry, choked sound, completely without humor. It was the sound of disbelief, of surrender. He dropped his hand and looked at her again, and now his eyes were bright, shining with unshed tears that did not fall. All these years, he said, his voice cracking just once before he controlled it. All these years I built it. I built the architecture to hold it, to keep it safe, to keep it in. I thought if I made the container complex enough, strong enough, no one would ever see what was inside. They would admire the walls. They would marvel at the design. He paused, shaking his head slowly. And you, a young woman from a small town, you walk right through the walls as if they were made of paper. You did not admire the container. You saw only what it held. He finally moved. He pushed himself up from his chair. He did not stand tall and imposing. He stood like a man who was very, very tired. He took a step toward the stage, then stopped, still keeping the distance between them. You called it a map, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He nodded slowly. And you followed it. To the very end. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a different smile on his face. It was not the thin, polite one. It was small, sad, and held a world of respect. It was the smile of one traveler recognizing another on a difficult road. You played my silence, he said, the words final and absolute. And you played it perfectly. Then he turned, not to her, but to the other students who were staring, utterly lost. He addressed them, his voice regaining a little of its old steadiness, but softer now. The class is dismissed. Thank you. It was over. Just like that. There was no more critique, no more instruction. He had given his final verdict, and it was not about technique or structure. It was about truth. The students stood up quietly, gathering their things in a hushed, confused shuffle. They filed out, casting long, puzzled looks back at Ilara, who still sat at the piano, and at the maestro, who had turned to look out the high window at the cold blue sky. Eliara stood, her legs trembling. She didn't know what to do. She picked up her wrinkled sheet music and began to walk off the stage. As she passed him, he spoke again, without turning from the window. "Wait," he said. "Please." He was not asking as a maestro. He was asking as a man. Alara stopped walking. The hall was empty now, except for the two of them. The heavy door at the back had swung shut behind the last student, and the quiet that returned was different. It wasn't the charged silence from before. It was the quiet of an empty space, late in the day, full of dust motes dancing in the slants of sun from the high window's dot. The maestro finally turned from the window. He looked at her, and she saw the effort it took for him to put his usual mask back on. But it was cracked. The sternness wouldn't hold. He just looked tired and real. "Come," he said, his voice low. "Sit, not there." He gestured away from the stage, to the first row of velvet seats. He himself sat down, not in his central, kingly seat, but in the one next to it, leaving space for her. Hesitantly, Alara walked down the 3 steps from the stage and sat in the chair he had indicated. She kept a seat between them, placing her worn sheet music on the empty velvet. The grand piano loomed behind them, a silent witness. For a while, he said nothing. He just looked at his hands, resting on his knees. He wasn't the maestro in this moment. He was just a man in a suit, sitting in a half-empty hall. 22 years, he said, not looking at her. It has been 22 years since I wrote that piece. In all that time, no one has ever heard it. Not until today. He glanced at her. They played the notes I wrote. They played the dynamics, the tempos. They played what was on the page. You played what was behind it. Alara didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. He turned his head sharply. "Sorry? Why?" For intruding. It felt like I was walking into a room I wasn't supposed to enter." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "You did not intrude. You were invited. I wrote the door. I just never believed anyone would find the key." He leaned back in his seat, the old velvet creaking. "Tell me, how did you find it? Not just the books. Anyone can read a book. What did you listen for?" Alara thought carefully, trying to find the words. "I listened for what wasn't there," she said slowly. "The opening. It's so loud and angry. But underneath, in the lower notes, there's a kind of shaking, like the anger is too big to hold. So I didn't just play it loud. I tried to play the shaking too, the fear inside the rage." He closed his eyes for a second, as if her words were a memory. "Go on. And the middle," she continued, gaining a little confidence from his silence. "Everyone tries to make the awkward rhythm smooth, because they're hard. But I thought, what if they're hard because the person is broken? They're not supposed to be smooth. They're supposed to feel like you've forgotten how to walk. So I let them be clumsy. I let the melody get lost. And the end?" He asked, his eyes still closed. "The end is the most honest part," she said softly. "It's not peaceful. Peace would be a relief. This is absence. It's the sound of a house when everyone has left. You don't play that with a beautiful tone. You play it with a true tone, clear, cold, empty." He opened his eyes. They were wet, but no tears fell. "You are not a young horse," he said, his voice thick. "That was a foolish thing for me to say. You are a seismograph. You feel the tremors deep in the earth that the rest of us only see when the buildings crack." He fell silent again, looking up at the high ceiling of the hall. "I have spent 2 decades teaching control," he said, more to himself than to her. "I have taught that emotion must be shaped, disciplined, put in a cage of technique. I believed that was the only way to make art that lasts. I was wrong. I was teaching them to build cages. You showed me that the art is not in the cage. It is in the wild creature inside. The technique is not there to imprison it. It is there to give it a voice so powerful it can shake the walls. He looked at her now directly, his gaze intense. What you have is not a lack of discipline. It is a different kind of discipline, the discipline of fearless empathy. It is much, much rarer. Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a relief so deep it was almost painful. He understood. He saw her, not as a flawed version of the other students, but as something entirely different. "What do I do with it?" she asked, the question bursting out of her. It was the real question she had carried for years. Where does someone like me go? The music schools want perfection. They want the architecture first. They want the cage. For the first time, the maestro's expression became active, engaged. The teacher in him woke up, but a different kind of teacher. "You learn the architecture," he said firmly. "Not to live in it, but to use it. You must. To give that wild creature of yours the biggest, strongest voice possible, you need the tools. You need the strongest materials. You learn technique not to limit your feeling, but to set it free in a way the whole world can hear. What you did today in this hall was a miracle. But miracles need a structure to be repeated." He paused, thinking. "You will work with me," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. Elara's breath caught. "What?" "Privately. Not in a class. We will work together. You will learn the architecture from me. And I—" He smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, making him look 20 years younger. "And I will learn to listen to the creature again from you. It has been a long time since I listened." He stood up, a signal that the conversation was coming to an end. Elara stood too, her mind reeling. "Go home," he said. "Rest. You have journeyed a long way today. Next week, we begin. We start with Batch, the purest architecture. To give your soul a skeleton." He picked up her wrinkled sheet music from the velvet seat and handed it to her. "Do not lose this. This is your map. And now it is also mine again." He began to walk up the aisle toward the back of the hall, his steps slow but sure. Then he stopped and turned. "That smile," he said, from the shadows of the aisle. "On the first day, I am sorry for that smile. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten what music sounds like when it is alive. You have reminded me. Thank you." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Elara stood alone in the grand hall. The late afternoon sun was long and golden, painting the empty stage in warm light. She looked down at the sheet music in her hands, at her own small notes in the margin. Anger here, lost, empty, silence. She walked back to the piano and touched the cool, smooth wood of its lid. It was just an instrument now, not a beast. She had met the beast inside it, and inside herself, and had not been afraid. She left the hall, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city sounds rushed back in cars, distant sirens, people talking. The ordinary world. But she felt different in it. She wasn't just a student with raw talent anymore. She wasn't a young horse. She was a musician who had spoken a hard truth and found a guide in the wilderness. She walked home, not with the weight of judgment on her shoulders, but with a new, quiet certainty. The storm inside her had found its shape. It had learned the language of walls and windows, not to be trapped, but so its song could finally, clearly be heard. And for the first time, she knew exactly where she was going.